Hey everyone, welcome to Crime Talk with Meg. I have promised you all for a very long time that I would tell you the story of my inadvertent assistance in solving a murder case. I guess I finally have to pay up. So, grab your popcorn, sit back, relax, and let's talk about it. It all started late one evening in July of 1972. A teenage boy was playing outdoors near his home, which sat on the edge of the Croom Wildlife Management Area, which was a tract of the Withlacoochee State Forest. It was 7 p.m. and steamy hot, but the sun wouldn't set for another hour or more. The boy noticed something on the ground in the brush along the road leading into the wildlife area. It was a quilt wrapped around the decomposing body of a woman. She had been beaten about the face and head and strangled to death by what the coroner called very powerful hands. She had been stripped down to her bra and panties, had no identification or other identifying features. Her hair was cut short, maybe 6 inches. Many of her teeth were missing, and the ones remaining needed dental care bad. Her nails were dirty, like deep down dirty, from working outdoors for a long period of time. There was no hint of her identity, though. It was just her and the quilt. Law enforcement consisted of a very small department at the time, with only a handful of deputies patrolling the roads and handling all matters of crime within the county. Recently, a 15-year-old girl from the same area had been lured away from her home by a foster child her family had taken in. She was kidnapped and transported to a farm near the Florida-Alabama border, where she was assaulted and killed and buried in a shallow grave. 5 young men around the age of 18 were arrested and charged with first-degree murder in her death. Detectives immediately assumed the 2 cases were related, given their physical proximity. The young girl lived in the same small town where the unknown woman was found, and 1 or 2 other loose, uncorroborated statements. They had to be related, though. Murder didn't happen very often in small-town America. What were the chances? Local law enforcement was able to get the FBI involved in the case. The minimal evidence available was flown to Washington, D.C. That evidence consisted of the quilt and the woman's hands. They actually published this in the newspaper back then to give you an idea of how loose-lipped law enforcement was at the time. Things have certainly changed, haven't they? The FBI was able to obtain a usable set of fingerprints from the woman. Unfortunately, they did not match anything on file. The coroner was able to determine her approximate time of death as being 4 to 7 days prior to her body being found. This means she was likely killed over the weekend of July 15th to 16th of 1972. There were no missing persons reports or anything at all to help determine her identity. Ultimately, she was buried as a Jane Doe. The only evidence in the case was the bedspread. The following spring, officers were able to determine that the quilt came from a bunk bed in a mobile home trailer because of its size and round corner. In the late 60s, early 70s, Airstream and other pull-behind trailers were becoming very popular. Many set them up in trailer parks. This was a place where you parked your trailer at the time. And when they wanted to move or keep roaming, they hooked up their trailer and kept wandering. The woman's undergarments had no tags or identifying information. They were plain white. There were no pathology reports due to the state of decomp. Literally, all they had was the quilt. And apparently, she was never fingerprinted for a job and has no criminal arrest or convictions, investigators told the Tampa Tribune in April of 1973. Her prints were sent to sheriff's departments throughout the nation requesting comparisons, as well as missing persons reports with her general description. It seemed only one person knew her name, the person that put her there. And he was the only one who knew her name for 40 years. The detectives on the case called her Edna. They exhumed her body in 2015 for examination, additional testing, and to create a facial reconstruction.
Technology can be a blessing and a curse, and when it comes to solving crimes, it's definitely more of a blessing. Detectives in Hernando County are counting on new technology to help them solve a cold case from 47 years ago.
We don't know much about the woman whose body was found in a rural area of Brooksville in July of 1972. An approximate age, a ballpark height and weight, a few pieces of clothing. Investigators even had to make up a name for her.
My buddy had mentioned a while ago and said, hey, she looks like an Edna. I said, yeah, she could be an Edna. So at least we have a name to her.
But now, thanks to a Florida-based company that helps reconstruct facial images based off medical examiner records, Detective George Lloydgren has a new photo to put out on the Hernando County Sheriff's Office Facebook page.
Well, the technology, thank God, is advancing in a lot of different areas, and anything to better the case and move forward to hopes to identify her, that's what it's all about, getting to the truth of everything.
Earlier this month, Lloydgren sent this cold case off to FaceLogic's Facial Forensics. From there, the company created a new photo of what the victim would have looked like back in 1972.
The way we do it is just, it takes a lot less time and it can technically be more accurate. It looks more realistic and it's just basically today's standards.
Gives color to the person, gives them more realism, more lifelike, than, not that the clay mold isn't good. It gave a face when we had no face, but this gives more a realistic and lifelike look.
So while advancements in technology have helped breathe new life into cold cases like this one, Detective Lloydgren is still just now sitting and waiting for tips to roll in, which is where social media, another type of new technology, is helping solve cold cases all over the country.
The hope was, with all the advances in forensic science, Edna could have her name back. Her real name. Photos of the quilt were published, including a reconstruction drawn by a local artist from a black and white photo, which was all that was left, and a handwritten note on the back describing the colors. Hopes remained high, though, that someone would recognize the quilt and be able to identify the woman. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and the years kept ticking by. DNA testing had been done on the woman, but there were no matches in the system. Isotope analysis indicated she had lived in the U.S. for at least 5 to 10 years and consumed nutrients consistent with an American diet. Also, that she had been in Florida for several years prior to her death, which was great information, but still didn't provide a name for her. Then, several years ago, the detective on the case, George Lloydgren, had the idea to have a genetic genealogy analysis done. Genetic genealogists take the DNA sample and find a matching relative in a public online database. I'm going to take a few minutes to explain this for 2 reasons. One, it's something very simple you can do to help solve some of these cold cases. And number 2, some people are very concerned about their privacy of their DNA, and I want you to know how the system works, because it's kind of mysterious to a lot of people. Penny said she would like to help me explain. So when you have your DNA tested through the popular sites like Ancestry.com, 23andMe, MyHeritage, you receive your results on those sites and it's compared against the users of those sites alone. The only other people who have access to it are people who you specifically approve to have access to your account. Law enforcement, researchers, nobody else has access to your DNA. There are other sites called GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, as well as some others, where you can export your DNA data from the main sites, Ancestry, 23andMe, and upload it to these sites. GEDmatch, Family Tree DNA, and a couple others have an option where you can select to opt in to allow law enforcement to access your DNA. And that is for research purposes to help locate family members, to help identify some of these missing people, as well as identify criminals when they have mysterious DNA in cases, things like that. The bonus to these sites is they offer some really interesting tools that you can use to compare kits. You can look up your archaic DNA matches. Apparently, I'm related to one of the icemen discovered in the 80s in the Pacific Northwest. You can even find out if your parents are related. It's pretty interesting, and there's lots of things that go on those sites, analyzing ancestors and tracking their paths of migration and all of that. Genetic genealogy has just become a thing in the past several years, but it is an absolutely amazing tool to help solve these decade-old cold cases. When the unidentified person's DNA has been in the system for years, but there's been no matches, now they're able to match family members and be able to determine who this person was, because often the family has no idea that the person is missing or deceased. So it's an invaluable tool. But it only works when there is a database to work from, and that database is comprised of volunteers who share their DNA. One of the leaders in the industry is a lab out of Texas called Othram. Othram is who did the genealogy work on this case. They had done the isotope analysis and the DNA extraction previously, but what happened here is they took and they did the genealogy tracing, and they were able to identify a son of the unidentified person. Once they identified the son, they collected his DNA, compared it directly one-to-one against the unidentified person's DNA, and then they were able to conclusively determine that, yes, this person was his mother, and they were able to find out her name. And with her name came some of her backstory. You see, during the 60s and the early 70s, domestic violence was a foreign concept. There were no services or support of any kind for women in abusive relationships like there are today. Even doctors usually declined to intervene. Those were matters of the home, between a husband and a wife. Those were private affairs. Child abuse was just starting to be recognized at this time. The prevailing attitude in the 60s was that spousal abuse was rare, and when it did happen, it was the result of some form of mental illness or psychological disorder, or that the woman was acting up and deserved it, which, looking back, is laughable. However, at the time, many scary problems we deal with on a daily basis were horrifying to society. It was easier to bury their head in the sand and pretend like it didn't exist than to address a problem so disturbing. It was so bad, domestic abuse was even made light of. Like in this early 1970s bowling alley advertisement from Saginaw, Michigan that read, "Have some fun, beat your wife tonight." Today, something like that would completely end a business. Back then, it was commonplace to both say similar things as well as act on them. The battered wives had no choice but to take the abuse. There were no shelters or services to help them get jobs or housing on their own, with who knows how many children to take care of. Even homeless shelters at the time did not accommodate women appropriately. For example, in 1973, a Los Angeles area shelter had 1,000 beds available for men and only 30 available for women. The divorce revolution was sweeping through the country in the 60s. But as we know, in rural areas, long held back morals and values are hard to break. Without the support of family, a woman is essentially stuck and left to suffer at the hands of her abusive husband. She was on her own to do what she had to do to protect her children and pray that she survived his anger each time. It wasn't until the mid to late 70s that women started banding together and speaking up for themselves. But even that wasn't enough. It took 20 years for the Violence Against Women Act to be signed by President Bill Clinton in 1994. But that was 22 years too late for this woman in eastern Kentucky. She was the mother of 2 young boys and had suffered years of abuse at the hands of her husband. The town she was living in was a blip on the map with a population of 5, maybe 600. It was once a bustling train depot with half a dozen tobacco factories, but that was 150 years ago. Although the details are unclear, the woman managed to escape the abuse in May of 1970, according to the divorce petition filed by the husband. He states, his cause of divorce herein that without fault or any fault on his part, the defendant has habitually behaved towards him for not less than 6 months in such a cruel and inhuman manner as to indicate a settled aversion towards him and to permanently destroy his peace and happiness. I suppose in those days you were supposed to thank a man for giving you a black eye. Wow. At the time of the divorce filing, their sons were ages 5 and 2. The husband kept the children and the home they jointly owned. She walked away with nothing, not even her boys, all to protect her life and theirs. She was allowed to visit 1 day each week at her mother's home. But this was a concession she should be grateful for. Her husband originally tried to terminate her parental rights altogether. At the time of the divorce filing, her address was listed as a rest home in a nearby town. A rest home is a term for a nursing home type facility. They generally cared for elderly, but also provided rehabilitation services, just like they do today. It's unclear why she was at this facility. She could have been working there, or she could have been a patient there. As part of the divorce, a deposition was taken of the husband in October. He said, she wouldn't and didn't stay home and take care of the kids, and she never cooked any meals. There was never anything to eat or anything done around the house. She just didn't stay home at all. She was very dissatisfied with living with me and the children. He continued later, I worked hard and tried to be a good husband, but she just wanted to roam. When asked where she was then, at that point in time, he said, last I knew of, she was at White Plains, but I have heard that she has gone to Florida. But with who? Where in Florida? Why Florida? The divorce was finalized in November of 1970. And that's where the paper trail ends. Most of you know how much I love research and occasionally work on cold cases. Did I say work on? I'm sorry, I meant fall down rabbit holes. Like the one time Cheryl McCollum posted a shoe tread pattern on Twitter and said, does anybody recognize this? And a group of us spent over a month looking at every tread pattern we could find until someone stumbled across an obscure Mexican work boot that matched the pattern. Yeah, it was bad. I know too much about shoe patterns now. There's also the Invisible Man case, who I actually did a video on, where authorities have been trying to identify him for over 30 years. He was using the identity of a young boy that had been killed after being hit by a car. And even the woman he married still to this day doesn't know his real identity. I spent countless hours searching every corner of the internet for information, trying to work on these cases. One day, years ago, I was scrolling through NamUs, which houses the database for missing and unidentified people. I came across a posting that showed a weird vintage pineapple quilt, and I was hooked. I spent hours and hours looking for the quilt. The pattern looked so familiar, but I couldn't find it. I couldn't find anything even remotely close, but I felt like I knew it. And every couple months, I would run across UP 6043. UP stands for Unidentified Person in the database. And the hunt for the quilt would continue. It can become frustrating searching for the same thing over and over and over for years with no results. So imagine my excitement one day when I was scrolling through the news and I happened to see an article about a woman from a cold case being identified, and there was a picture of the quilt. I was elated, and I immediately needed to know everything about her, especially why she was unidentified for so long. I have a hard time understanding how people go missing and no one looks for them. I mean, someone knows you're gone. Someone notices. Are they scared? Do they want you gone? Are they just indifferent? Are they ignorant to the process? Or did you perhaps get lost in a pile of paperwork and everyone thinks someone else is looking for you? Whatever the reason, it's hard to comprehend. But that's what happened to Peggy. She went by her middle name, Joyce. Peggy Joyce Shelton. She was from a small town in Kentucky. She was married, mother of 2 young boys. There were 0 ties to Florida that I could find. It was amazing how much the photograph of her looked like the reconstruction that was done back in 2015. Peggy Joyce had married Andrew Nelson, reared 2 sons, and then divorced. I was unable to find any ties to the state of Florida, although her son said they had relatives in the area. In looking through the information about her, I found a marriage license in Hillsborough County. It listed her married name, though, Peggy Joyce Nelson. Hillsborough is the county for Tampa area of Florida. Peggy Nelson seemed like such a common name, though, so I ignored that fact and I kept looking. I was sure it was someone else. When I start researching someone, like deep dive research, usually for missing persons cases or major cases, I start with a family tree, partially because that's where the root of my research experience comes from. And also, it gives me a good basis to work from. It will give me dates and locations that I need to start a timeline. So I use Ancestry and other genealogy sites for a lot of my research, as well as so many public records forums. But while I was playing around in Ancestry, as you probably know from the commercials, it gives you a hint or a leaf. And when you click on the leaf, it tells you the hint. And I know from using this site for many years that lots of the hints are incorrect. That is because people often just click on them and match up people incorrectly. So I ignored it because there was nothing to indicate that that was her. Now, when you hit ignore on a hint, you aren't supposed to see it again. It should have been gone. But with Joyce, the hint kept popping back up for the Tampa marriage. I saw it multiple times, and it was to the point I was getting a little annoyed. And finally, I looked into it one day, and it had her married name, Peggy Joyce Nelson, but there was no date of birth. There was a corresponding address on Nebraska Avenue in Tampa. Now, parts of Nebraska are what you would call seedy. One time while passing through, I was sitting at a red light and 2 men were crossing the intersection in opposite directions. It was like slow motion, like you would see in a movie as they were walking towards each other. One of them pulled the white tank top undershirt. He pulls it up and shows his piece to the other guy, who at the same time pulled his out of his back waistband and pointed it at the first guy's head. They like spun around each other like some kind of dance move in the middle of the intersection. And then they put their sidearms away and went on their way. And right behind them, there was the lady pushing a baby in a stroller and was just humming along like nothing had happened. I mean, she saw it. I was freaking out, scared little white girl downtown, didn't know where I was. And this was like normal life for that area, I guess. You have to be tough to survive there, that's for sure. That doesn't mean it was like that back in the early 70s. However, it's never been Rodeo Drive by any means. So the address that was listed on Peggy Joyce Nelson marriage license from Hillsborough County was a small trailer park, the kind that housed the type of trailers you pull behind a truck, like Airstreams, the kind that had bunk beds with weird shaped bedspreads. Across the street was a lounge, initially known as the Duck Inn. Get it? Duck Inn. Ha ha ha. Then they changed the name to the library. Go-go dancers were often sought in the local paper to staff the place. Quite a few jokes were made on the Tampa history page about men going to the library back in the day. The trailer park wasn't too far from the campus of the University of South Florida. It was also right near the newly built Interstate 75. I-75 starts in northern Michigan at the Canadian border near Sault Ste. Marie, and it was originally supposed to stop in Tampa. In the late 1960s, as they were nearing the end of construction, the growth in Southwest Florida was booming, and this decision was made to continue down through Southwest Florida and then eventually across the Everglades to make what is now known as Alligator Alley. Why is it called Alligator Alley? Because they have to have fences down the majority of the road to keep the gators off the road. You see them lined up against the fence. It's really creepy and scary, especially because there's lots of holes in the fence. The location where Joyce's body was ultimately found was just 3 miles off one of the exits of the newly built Interstate 75. It was down a residential road, just onto a dirt road leading into the wildlife management area. A portion of this area was frequented by motorbike enthusiasts who were in the midst of a huge conflict with locals at the time. Ordinarily, I would say where she was found was very desolate, isolated area, and someone would need to have some familiarity with the location. However, the fight over Croom and the motorbikes had been in the newspapers for some time, making many people across a wide area familiar with it. So everything was lining up. I didn't know Joyce's history from the time she left Kentucky until she was found, or why she would leave her kids and come to Florida and potentially marry someone else, just walk away and start a new life. Detective Lloydgren, on the other hand, knew all the answers I didn't. He had reached out to Joyce's son. Her former husband had passed away in 2004. He remarried in 73, but was divorced again 5 years later. He was a machinist and stayed his entire life in the tiny little Kentucky town of 500 people. His granddaughter had fond memories of him growing up. He and Joyce's oldest son, on the other hand, was able to recall his parents' volatile relationship through his early childhood. Through conversations with various family members, Detective Lloydgren was able to surmise Joyce didn't walk away. She fled an abusive relationship. She gave up everything to save her life and possibly her children's. Her son had always believed she up and left them to live her best life with someone else. He never considered that something tragic may have happened to her. When he was notified of her death, he was shocked, obviously grief-stricken, but also had this strange sense of relief knowing she didn't stop caring and walk away. Joyce's youngest son never got to know his mother. He was only 2 when his parents divorced and his mother left. He also never got to know her fate. In 2001, Kit Nelson was at Mushy's Tavern in Christian County, Tennessee. He got into a verbal altercation with Dennis Ray Adams, who in turn stabbed him with a knife. A subsequent lawsuit by Kit's wife and daughter alleged the owners of the tavern failed to provide life-saving measures. Adams was sentenced to 13 years in prison for the death of Kit Nelson. Joyce's father had died when she was young. Her mother remarried her 3rd husband and had another child. Joyce had 1 biological brother and numerous step-siblings. All of them had passed by the time Joyce's identity was discovered. Because of this, little information was found on where she went after her divorce, why she was staying at a rest home, why she went to Florida, or how she met her new husband that she married in Tampa. Even after Joyce was identified, it was still believed that the cases between her and Marian Ogden were connected. At the time I contacted Detective Lloydgren, he was still tracking down leads related to Marian's case. There was one tip that said they had seen a truck similar to one driven by the boys convicted in Marian's case broken down not far from where Joyce was discovered. Another said they saw their vehicle drive down into the wildlife management area with 3 people and come back with just 2. Another identified Joyce as being part of the hippie-style group that took Ogden and lured her out of town. And then finally, a fourth said that Joyce was a hitchhiker who was staying at a motel and had been driven in from out of town. At that point, all but one of the group responsible for Marion Ogden's vicious slaying had died while incarcerated. Detective Lloydgren did several local news interviews and had a few podcasts online to help spread awareness of the case. He released photos of the quilt in hopes that somebody would recognize it and call in a tip that would give him the answers he needed. I generally assume that law enforcement knows more than me, and I'm right about that 99.9% of the time. However, sometimes, very rarely, I'm wrong. Very fortunately, in this situation, I listened to my gut and not my brain. The Tampa marriage for Joyce was nagging at me. I was sure that the detectives already looked at this information and vetted it in whatever way possible. But something kept telling me to send it to them anyways. I very hesitantly tried to find an email address for Detective Lloydgren, but no luck. He's a phone call kind of guy. He's a meet in person kind of guy. He's a travel halfway across the country to have a face-to-face conversation with you instead of doing a FaceTime call kind of guy, which is what makes him an excellent detective. I tried to find a tip line or anywhere I could send an anonymous message and feel better about myself, but nope. Then I remembered I used to correspond with someone on the Web Sleuth's website named Scully, which I assumed was a man with the name Scully, possibly George or someone he worked with. I wasn't on the Web Sleuth site anymore. I had a pretty big disagreement over the treatment of victims and accusations against innocent people with no basis whatsoever. And I'm actually banned from the site for expressing my views and disagreeing with the power-tripping moderators. So I used my techie skills and worked around the ban and created a burner account and sent Scully a message. The next thing I knew, Scully, whose name is Byrne, and I were going back and forth sharing information about the case and discussing other cases. With a name like Byrne, the image in my head was big burly country boy who's been around the block, knows a thing or two. Byrne let me know how they were a citizen detective and did research very similar to what I did on my free time as a hobby to assist the local detectives, which is pretty awesome. And then Byrne gave me a call, and boy was I in for a shock. She had such a sweet, soft voice, and yeah, I definitely am not always right. What Byrne did tell me, though, was that somehow they didn't have the marriage information. She and the detective had the same reaction I did at first. This can't be her. So we spent a few days ruling out every other Peggy Nelson, Joyce Nelson, Peggy Joyce, Joyce Shelton, Peggy Shelton, anybody else with a name remotely similar to hers in the entire Central Florida area in the 70s. And by that point, we were pretty sure it was her. Researchers from the University of South Florida were able to obtain the original court filing for the marriage license, but it didn't have a date of birth. While we were sure it was her, there wasn't any corroborating evidence, so we kept searching. Somehow, I was able to locate an obscure court filing where a public notice was posted in a Kentucky newspaper back in the 90s. It was regarding some kind of land rights or mining rights that was owned by her family. It listed her siblings, step-siblings, aunts, nieces, nephews, and her name, both married names. So it was her. She got married in Tampa after leaving her relationship in Kentucky. Why does this matter? Why does this change anything? because Peggy Joyce Nelson ran away from an abusive marriage straight into the arms of a serial killer. And if you want to know more, you will have to stay tuned because I will follow up next week with part 2. So make sure you hit that subscribe button and hit the bell so you are notified. And I will see you next week with the rest of the story. Until then, take care.